Asia. Banyan. Mandarins for Mandarin.
Mandarins for Mandarin.
Whatever happened to Singapore's real mother tongue?
Whatever happened to Singapore's real mother tongues?
When Sandy, a young Chinese Singaporean, learned that her grandmother was terminally ill, she signed up for a workshop in the Hokkien language run by LearnDialect.sg, a charity founded to help Singaporeans communicate with the city-state's older Chinese residents, including within their own families.
When Sandy, a young Chinese Singaporean, learned that her grandmother was terminally ill, she signed up for a workshop run by LearnDialect.sg, founded a charity founded to help the country's Chinese residents. Help Singaporeans communicate with the state's older Chinese residents, including within their families. With the city-states, older Chinese residents.
Sandy is fluent in English and Mandarin.
Sandy is fluent in English and Mandarin,
the official mother tongue of Chinese Singaporeans. Fluent in English and Mandarin, the official mother tongue of Chinese Singaporeans.
The official mother tongue of Chinese Singaporeans.
Her grandmother spoke little of either. Before she died, Sandy thrilled her by asking in Hokkien, "What was your childhood like?"
Before she died, Sandy thrilled her by asking in Hokkien, "What was your childhood like?"
She was even able to understand some of the answer. Their language barrier was the product of decades of linguistic engineering. English has been the language of instruction in nearly all schools since 1987 to reinforce Singapore's global competitive edge.
English has been the language of instruction in nearly all schools since 1987 to reinforce Singapore's global competitive edge. 바뀌었냐?
But depending on ethnicity, pupils study a second language, typically Mandarin, Malay, or Tamil.
But depending on ethnicity, pupils study a second language, typically Mandarin, Malay, or Tamil.
These are intended, as Lisa Lim of the University of Sydney puts it, to add cultural ballast vis-à-vis English.
These are intended, as Lisa Lim of the University of Sydney puts it, to add cultural ballast vis-à-vis English.
In the case of Mandarin, its acquisition has been reinforced by the government's annual Speak Mandarin campaign started in 1979.
In the case of Mandarin's acquisition has been reinforced by the government's Speak Mandarin campaign started in 1979.
Mandarin is a standardized version of the language spoken by the people of the vast plains of northern China.
Mandarin is the standardized version of the language spoken by the people of the vast plains of northern China.
Yet hardly any of the Chinese
northern China
from whom Singaporeans are descended hailed from there.
Yet hardly any of the Chinese from whom Singaporeans are descended hailed from there.
They came instead from the southern provinces of Fujian, Guangdong, and Hainan, and so spoke different languages. Hokkien, Cantonese, and Hakka, along with two Hokkien-related tongues, Chu Chao and Hainanese.
They came instead from the southern provinces of Fujian, Guangdong, and Hainan, and so spoke different languages, Hokkien, Cantonese, and Hakka, along with two Hokkien-related tongues, Teochew and Hainese.
The Speak Mandarin campaign sought to destroy Chinese Singaporeans' real mother tongues, first by demeaning them as provincial dialects of Mandarin, when they are in fact mutually unintelligible languages as different as English, German, and Danish.
The Speak Mandarin campaign sought to destroy Chinese Singaporeans' real mother tongues, first demeaning them as provincial dialects of Mandarin, when in fact they are mutually unintelligible languages as different as English, German, and Danish.
Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding father, who started learning Chinese in his 30s, promoted the now discredited notion that humans have a tightly limited capacity for language. Hokkien and all the rest undermined the official bilingualism by hogging chunks of children's memories.
Lee Kuan Yew, the country's founding father, who started learning Chinese in his 30s, promoted the now discredited notion that humans have tightly limited capacity for language. Hokkien and all the rest undermined the official bilingualism by hogging chunks of the children's memories.
Further, the Great Tidier disliked the diversity embodied in these languages and wanted to forge a single Chinese identity.
Further, the Great Tidier disliked the diversity embodied in these languages and wanted to forge a single Chinese identity.
Reason enough to foist on Chinese Singaporeans an alien language.
Reason enough to foist on Chinese Singaporeans an alien language.
Lee also thought that China's opening promised riches to those who could speak its official language.
Lee also thought that China's opening promised riches to those who could speak its language.
So,
official language.
Dialects were disparaged.
So dialects were disparaged.
In the early 1980s, television and radio programming in these languages all but disappeared, cutting many people adrift.
In the early 1980s, television and radio programs in these languages all but disappeared, cutting many people adrift.
To speak dialect with your child, the government warned, is to ruin his future.
To speak dialect with your child, the government warned, is to ruin his future.
By the campaign's own yardsticks, the success is striking. By the programs, the campaign's own yardstick, the success is striking. Use of Chinese vernaculars at home has collapsed from 76% of Chinese households in 1980 to 16% in 2015.
The use of Chinese dialects, Chinese vernaculars at home has collapsed from 76% of Chinese households in 1980 to 16% in 2015.
Over the same period, the use of Mandarin rose from 13% of Chinese households to 46%.
Over the same period, the use of Mandarin rose from 13% of Chinese households to 46%.
But the linguistic engineering has had an unintended consequence. The use of English is now increasing faster, especially among younger families. Over 70% of households with children at primary school use it as their main language, undermining Mandarin and vernaculars.
But the linguistic engineering has had an unintended consequence. The use of English is now increasing faster, especially among younger families. 70% of the households with children at primary school use it as their main language, undermining Mandarin and vernaculars.
And so a debate about the costs of language policies has grown since Lee's death in 2015.
So a debate about the cost of the language policies has grown since Lee's death in 2015.
same year, the 50th anniversary of the nation's founding was accompanied by an outpouring of sentimentality over Singapore's roots.
The same year, the 50th anniversary of the country's founding was accompanied by an outpouring of sentimentality over Singapore's roots.
These days, officials are a bit readier to tolerate Singapore's linguistic variety.
These days, officials are a bit readier to tolerate Singapore's linguistic variety.
Lee Kuan Yew once called Singlish, the country's vibrant mashup of English, Malay and Chinese vernaculars, a handicap.
Lee Kuan Yew once called Singlish, the country's vibrant mashup of English, Malay and Chinese vernaculars, a handicap.
Lee's son, the Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, claims to be proud of Singapore's unique form of Mandarin.
Lee's son, the Prime Minister, claims to be proud of Singapore's unique form of the Mandarin.
For instance, the Malay for market, pasar, has been imported as basha.
For instance, the Malay for market, pasha, has been imported as masha.
That would be unintelligible to a mainland Chinese.
That would be unintelligible to a mainland Chinese.
Yet that only highlights a paradox Mr. Lee does not acknowledge.
Yet that only highlights a paradox that Mr. Lee does not acknowledge.
On the one hand, he praises Singaporean Mandarin because it supposedly reinforces a Chinese Singaporean identity.
On the one hand, he praises what? He praises Singaporean Mandarin and because it supposedly reinforces the Chinese Singaporean identity.
On the other, he frets about others stealing a march in China because of their more fluent Mandarin.
On the other, he frets about others stealing a show in China because of their more fluent Mandarin.
Meanwhile, younger Singaporeans are embracing former mother tongues. Ski Yo and Eugene Lee were motivated to found LearnDialect.sg upon seeing an elderly Cantonese speaker in a nursing home struggle to communicate that she was cold.
Lee and Yu were motivated to found LearnDialect.sg upon seeing an elderly Cantonese speaker in a nursing home struggled to communicate that she was cold.
Health workers have signed up to their courses, while others want to say the right things at family gatherings over the Lunar New Year.
Health officials have signed up to their courses, while others want to say the right thing at family gatherings at the Lunar New Year.
There's an uptick in Hokkien television programming.
There's an uptick in Hokkien television programming.
And everyone admits that effete Mandarin is useless for swearing.
And everyone admits that effete Mandarin is useless for swearing.